when we have a healthy level of competition, allowing AI content to be copyrightable is actually beneficial for model development.
Welcome to the Regulating AI podcast. Join host Sanjay Puri as he explores the dynamic and developing world of artificial intelligence governance. Each episode features deep dives with global leaders at the forefront of regulating AI responsibly, tackling the challenges using AI can bring about head-on and enabling balance without hindering innovation.
Welcome to the Regulating AI podcast. Artificial intelligence, AI, stands at the forefront of technological revolution. So how do we regulate it without stifling innovation? Our podcast features insights from various perspectives. We've had industry leaders to government officials to leaders of advocacy groups. Together, they address pivotal questions that are needed to create practical and sensible legislation. I'm very excited to have Professor Alex Yang with us today. He's a professor of management science and operations at the London Business School. He got his PhD at the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago. He's also been a visiting professor at the University of Hong Kong. I invited him on this show as it is very important to get many different perspectives towards framing AI legislation. And we need to get global perspectives on this transformative technology. Welcome, Alex. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the Regulating AI podcast.
Sanjay, thank you for having me. I've been a big fan of the show. I enjoyed some of your previous podcasts, which have been very informative and insightful.
Well, thank you, Professor. That's very kind of you. Professor, for our listeners who are global political leaders, their staff, think tank people, industry, and advocacy groups, can you tell us a little bit about your background and a little bit about what you do to begin this conversation?
My interaction with AI actually started very early. So back in undergraduate, I was my major is in electrical engineering. Well, the specific major back in China was actually called automation. And so my first sort of class on AI was probably in the last century. I feel sort of bad in the sense that I've learned neural network back then, but I wasn't visionary enough to see that it's going to evolve into this super powerful technology as we see it today. And after that, I went to the US for my graduate school. And as you mentioned, I graduated from the Chicago Booth, the business school, a doctoral degree in management. And since then, I've been living mostly in London. My research have been focusing on mainly how do you think from a very holistic value chain, what I would call value chain perspective, in understanding a lot of the pricing issues we see in today's business world. So my recent work involves applying this value chain approach on digital platforms and most recently, artificial intelligence.
Thank you for that background. You have tremendous background. Professor, when you look at artificial intelligence, what do you see the biggest risk that we should be looking at from AI?
Well, that's a $1 trillion question. For me, I grew up watching the Terminator movie, so I always thought that existential risk is the biggest risk. But of course, if I think about I do a lot of research related to risk management. If you think about how do we manage risk, there's the two dimensions of a risk. One is the probability, how likely this is going to happen, and the other is the value at stake. If this really happened, how bad could it be for human? If we look at these two dimensions, I would say the biggest risk in terms of value at stake, and I don't think the probability is completely zero. Exactly, existential risk. So in terms of regulation, I guess this type of risk, the regulatory focus is probably more on monitoring, right? Especially monitoring at a global scale. The good thing about training artificial, especially extremely powerful artificial intelligence model is that there is a very sort of, if we think of from a value chain or supply chain perspective, there is a clear hardware bottleneck, which is computer chips. And that allows global government, if they could work together to identify who have the capability of creating this type of risk, and that allows them to better monitor that. But if I think about risk that are probably a little bit more pricing, I would say probably large scale job displacement. So we have seen over the last 20, 30 years, globalization has already cost the developed country a lot of jobs, but those are mostly blue collar workers. Right. And generative AI there are a lot of research that show this will probably replace or change the job description, job responsibility of a lot of white collar workers. So I personally believe governments or regulatory agencies need to act proactively on this dimension.
Professor, you identified two main risks. One is an existential risk. So I want to address both of them, and the other one is the job displacement that would happen. In terms of existential risk, I presume you're talking about AGI, artificial general intelligence, where this AI becomes even more powerful than human beings. We've had many guests. We've had guests who believe in existential risk, people who really believe that we need a pause, etc. When you look at AGI, and we had Mark Zuckerberg from Meta saying that they are going to even open source AGI, open source that technology. You have a tremendous background in this. For our listeners, do you have a time frame, or can you even predict a time frame for AGI or some level, so to give regulators some perspective? Because there is a follow-on question to that. But do you have any kind of a perspective, or are you a believer that we should have some kind of a pause system for in terms of this?
That's a great question. I don't have a timeline, to be completely honest. I don't
Okay.
know if anyone have that, right?
Hmm.
If you listen to like true expert like Jack Hinton,
Hmm.
right? He thinks there is a sort of tangible probability, a tangible risk. I do think we should think of a trigger mechanism where if something happens, we should start to pause this. I don't think we are at that stage yet. In particular, because right now, well, whether you refer to this as artificial general intelligence, or some people like to call this if we're really talking about Skynet type of thing, it's really super artificial intelligence. I don't think we're there yet. The sort of good side, I guess, in terms of safety
Hmm.
of this is artificial intelligence are still mainly in the digital space. You can't the current artificial intelligence, if you look at robotics, they can't really physically take over the world, which makes me a little bit more relieved. So, but I do think government all over the world should start collaborate and start to talk, trying to figure out a trigger mechanism. It's a little bit like in that dimension, it's a little bit like I like to relate that to nuclear weapon.
You made some very good points, Professor. One is we are not there yet, and nobody really knows, which is true, whether it's Jeff Hinton or others. And then we should have some kind of a trigger mechanism, like similar to nuclear weapons. A lot of our guests keep talking about nuclear weapons and things of that nature. To follow up, nobody knows the timeline, but suddenly the world woke up one day and we had ChatGPT. I hope it's not going to be that suddenly we wake up a few months or timeline, etc., and we have, you call it super intelligence, and then everybody's scrambling trying to figure out. And you say a trigger mechanism, just to follow that up a little bit, that would involve a lot of international collaboration because, it's like the nuclear uh, stuff. If everybody agrees to nuclear, but there are a few countries who don't, then really the value of the trigger mechanism would be lost. So you are visualizing a real international collaboration because we have a lot of international listeners. We have listeners from around the world. We have legislators who listen around the world also. So you are saying that international collaboration is very critical. How do you visualize that happening, Professor?
Well, it could. It's good, very good question. I think it could take in different format, right? Like
Hmm.
a few months ago, the UK had the AI summit,
So, yeah.
right, which involved pretty much all the major economies in the world,
Hmm.
which I
Hmm.
think is a good start. There, of course, has to be some trust that is built up gradually. Now, if we look at there seems it almost makes I don't want to start the show with being very pessimistic, but it almost get me. Sometimes I wonder if the world simulation theory is actually true. Do you think that our audience are they familiar with the simulation theory?
Why don't you please tell them? Because we have audience of all kinds, so it would be helpful just briefly if you can tell our
Well, the
audience.
idea of
Are you talking about something like the Matrix?
certain almost yes.
Okay.
Well, I don't
Please
know
tell
if
our
it's more
audience.
or less than that. So the
Okay.
idea of course, this is a hypothetical sort of almost
Mhm.
like sci-fi, or you can call it conspiracy sort of theory, right? The idea
Mhm.
is we don't live in the real world. The real world that we live in was actually a super realistic simulation that was run by some other agent, right? Whether a supercomputer or some super intelligent species. If you play game, you would know that the game are designed in a way to sort of entertain the gamers. And if we are the NPCs in the game, then the game designers would like to create things that sort of entertains them, but make us suffering. So right now we have this brilliant technology which will bring in tremendous amount of productivity, but on the other hand, it also imposes some major risk. But this technology particularly happened at a point where people are talking about de-risking, deglobalization. There's a lot of geopolitical tension. The timing is not perfect. I think if we're really going to make this work, there has to be more trust built among major economies, especially those economies that have significant computing power or significant production capacity that could generate this type of computing power.
Professor, you talked, I mean, we've had many, many, many guests. We've never had somebody talk about the matrix and this simulation theory, which is very, very interesting that we are actually part of some entertaining some people. And maybe this podcast is too entertaining some of these pieces. But that's a very interesting concept. Now, the question that kind of relates to what you're saying is, there is this whole issue of, as you said, trust. There is this whole AI nationalism that has happened. And you hear the head of NVIDIA, Jensen Huang, talk about how every country should have their own large language model. And you're starting to see a lot of countries saying, hey, we need to invest. It's like the nuclear club. If you don't have a large language model, part of it is, it gives people an ego boost, but also I think to retain their culture, their language, and those things, I think it is very important. But how do you see this AI nationalism kind of play out? Because it's also, there are some checks and balances with these chips, as you said, these expensive processing happen. Do you believe every country should have their own large language model?
Specifically, if we're talking about model level, I believe so,
Okay.
because we're really thinking building these models. Of course, there are different layers of the model, right? You have
Hmm.
the foundational model, you can fine tune it, right? Each of us, in principle, could build sort of a customized large language model. They are not a foundational model that is different from others. This type of customization is helpful. So I think whether we're talking about a specific country, a specific market, or a specific sort of community which they have their local dialect. Right. I'm
Hmm.
originally from China. We have a lot of local dialect that if they want to preserve, I certainly think we should train models that incorporate this
Hmm.
so that you made a great point. I haven't thought about this before, but large language model probably could act as a means to better preserve this type of cultural heritage, right? We were teaching a generative AI last year, the first time, in London Business School, and A few of my students were telling me that one interesting application they use ChatGPT is actually to practice their second or third language. And that, of course, built on the sort of requirement, the foundation that this language is embedded within the large language model. To that extent, I would think I'm mostly positive that we should have large language models that capture, if not all, the vast majority of existing knowledge base or languages. In terms of AI nationalism, I think that probably is a little bit different. So should every country have NVIDIA? I don't know what Mr. Huang is going to say about this. So these are tremendous amount of investment, and there are if you think about supply chain investment. One of these factories will cost billions of dollars. And I don't know if every economy should be reinventing
Right.
the wheel. A very good point I think related that you were alluding to is if you think about the chip bank, right? China is almost now forced to build up their own chip making
Chip
capacity,
manufacturing.
which could lead to some unintended consequences that the West didn't expect.
Like,
I'm conjecturing a little bit, right? If you
mhm,
think about China is a country that has tremendous production capacity. This is a country where the government is very sort of flexible in terms of designing their industrial policies.
right.
Like if you see today's Financial Times have an article saying a lot of city government in China were actually handing out these coupons or vouchers, they call computer vouchers, to AI startups because computing is expensive and the government wants to subsidize. Right? This as a supply chain person, this scenario sounds very familiar to me. Right? If you
Mm,
look at solar panel, you look at electrical vehicle, especially
vehicles.
electrical vehicle batteries. Well, I don't think the West would want to have the scenario where China using this large scale industrial policy to really push for AI chips or for other computing chips that one day could flood the West market. So that's why I think it's important to have, going back to our international collaboration point of view, I think it's important that countries start to have more constructive dialogue.
More constructive dialogue. I completely agree with you. Professor, you touched on some things. Being based in London, obviously, you're familiar with the EU, with the UK safety summit they had. Give us a little bit, if you have some experience in terms of what China is doing in terms of its regulation, because people say that they've been very strong on, in fact, in many ways, ahead of most countries or even EU. Do you have some perspective in terms of what China is doing in terms of AI regulation?
I'm not a China expert. I have lived in
No,
probably
okay.
the US and
No
UK
worries.
for the last
Yeah.
20 years. Of course, I still,
Mhm,
because of my background, my heritage, I still pay attention
mhm,
to China's policy, right? My very high level understanding is China at this level, at the like industrial policy level, China is quite pragmatic.
mhm,
And they really wanted to, especially they are seeking for a new sort of growth driver, right, for the
mhm,
economy.
mhm,
This you may find my co-author's work more related. Angela is a better is a
mhm.
much more capable expert on
Sure.
Chinese AI regulation. Yeah.
Professor, the whole concept of open source versus closed source, you subtly touched a little bit on it. There are two schools of thought that open source is good for innovation, entrepreneurship. Meta, IBM, Mistral, to a certain extent, just recently announced a closed source deal also with Microsoft. And then there is OpenAI, Microsoft that are on the closed source. There are some people who say, hey, there's some risk to it. What are your thoughts in terms of this school of thought?
I agree with both schools of thought. I think there is certainly the positive side, right?
Hmm.
The open source, if you look at the entire science community, it's based on open source, and it certainly enables a lot of great, like in terms of research idea generation, right? Which
Hmm.
could come back to benefit everybody. But there is also the risk component. What if this open source model is used by some wrong players, some malicious users? That's why I believe right now the technology giants are probably adopting a two-tiered approach, right? Their most advanced models are not open source. They only because there is a significant amount of risk related to the state of the art model, which they are still playing with or testing, if we're being more formal. And but the second tier, which they more or less have very good idea of what the model is capable or is incapable to do. Open source it is probably going to lead more positive side versus negative side. One complication here is the competition landscape. We think about there is one sort of good intended company who have this policy, they will they will manage their or release their model in this optimal two-layered sort of structure.
Mhm.
But if we take competition into consideration, I think it becomes less clear whether some people, because they are not considered the AI leaders in the world, they may go
Mhm.
more aggressive. They try to compete, create a different dimension to compete. That may actually lead to some more overly aggressive policy in terms of releasing open source models. I think that's something we need to look at.
So that leads me to really the question that you kind of alluded to. In the US and even with the EU Act that they did, there is been a fear of monopoly of tech companies controlling AI like they control social media. The EU AI Act, with its basically horizontal approach, has tried to do it, even though maybe there's some room to be left. Are you concerned about, because it takes so much money to build some of these models, whether it's large language models, etc.? Are you concerned about monopolies, and what solutions do you have for our regulators here in the US?
To some extent, I do.
Hmm.
But in general, I think the technology space, if we look at especially generative AI, right? Well, I'm not completely concerned. Like this doesn't worry me that much because 10 years ago, if we think about the leader of AI, that's absolutely Google. We have AlphaGo, and the transformer model was developed by Google Brain.
Hmm.
Everybody think AI is going to be dominated by Google. But then the product that really surprised the world is not developed by Google. Of course, we say this is related to Microsoft, but this still shows sort of the entrepreneurial sort of spirit or the capability. You mentioned Mistral. That's another example, right? It's a very
Hmm.
very small company led by a few people. Yeah, they've made tremendous success. So on that part, I'm not particularly worried that monopoly is going to hinder innovation to that extent. But I do worry a little bit about, in general, the lack of competition on the welfare of consumers. This, however, is probably more a more generic, a more general competition policy problem, which we have accumulated hundreds, maybe more than 100 years of knowledge on how to do that.
Because I mean, you 2 points that you just made. One is when you look at companies like Mistral, most of these companies now have investments from these big tech companies. OpenAI with Microsoft. Mistral recently got investment from, because the amount of money that is needed, very few people, even VCs, are going to fork up. It's these cash-rich tech companies. Anthropic is Google, Amazon, on and on. So it's basically the same companies that are doing that. That's a little bit of a worrisome. But when you saw recently what a Google image generator, the fiasco that happened, that tells you the stakes that are there for people who are going to control these large language models, because they can tell you about our history. They can educate you about our history, about our health, about our culture, about our medicine in whatever way they want. And that can be a little worrisome. Any thoughts that you have on that?
The Gemini incident is
All
indeed
right.
very interesting. And my understanding is this has something to do with the implicit prompt transformation or prompt engineering that
Mm-hmm.
Google wants to build in, right? If
Mm-hmm.
this type of technology is done correctly, it's a great booster for productivity, right? If I
Mm-hmm.
look at some of the prompt they wrote, I can never write a prompt as
Mm-hmm.
good as they do. But I
Mm-hmm.
share your point that we don't want to have one or two technology companies to sort of dictate a lot of things. To that extent, I'm relatively optimistic because it seems that different companies are taking different approaches. OpenAI is not super aggressive on this type of prompt transformation. They are doing something else. They provide a little bit more transparency.
Mm-hmm.
And Google, probably as a bigger player, they are more concerned about their reputational damage. So they want to be more proactive in the DI front. But now with this backlash, I think being a large company will also require them to, will also sort of force them to take one step back. I think that's a good thing. In general, if even you look at, for example, we've been talking about data privacy, right? If I make a
Mm-hmm.
parallel between AI and data privacy, the big players are taking different approaches, right?
Mm-hmm.
AI, like Apple, is in general adopting a more privacy conscious model. Well, some other players don't. So generally more privacy conscious, so I choose to use Apple product because I'm
Mm-hmm.
more certain that
Right.
whatever data I have stays within myself, within this device. The other thing related to monopoly, I think that's related is also when we talk about regulation, we really want to think about what kind of regulatory policies that could help incentivize these startup AI companies to create more sort of more innovative revenue models, right, or more sustainable revenue models that could allow them to be a challenger to the big players.
So far, we've been addressing your one big worry about AI risk, which is the existential risk. Now, let's talk about the other one, which is the job loss that you talked about. There have been all kinds of reports. McKinsey, IMF came out with a report that in the developed world, it could be up to 60% and mainly white collar jobs. The thing is, programmers, Jensen Wong said, you don't need programmers anymore, marketing people, customers, representatives. Recently, there's a fintech company called Clenara. They announced that they're letting, I think, 700 customer service reps go. Major transformation is underway, maybe not immediately, maybe a year or two, but everybody that has been on this show and this has said that it is underway. Firstly, do you agree with that? What will be the scale of that transformation and what can governments, because this will not just be a United States or a UK or a EU issue. I have a feeling it will be a global phenomenon. So, what can governments do towards that? So, those are basically three questions. Do you agree transformation? What will be the scale of it, and what would you recommend governments to do?
Right. Great questions. So for the first one, yes, I agree that there will be transformation. I'm more sort of probably more optimistic on that front. I think there are challenges, but also opportunity. There will be some jobs that are being replaced, but there are also new jobs that are going to be created, or not necessarily new jobs, but some sectors are going to be expanded, right? For example, content creators. I wasn't a well, I don't have the artistic background or skill to generate any content for consumption. But now with Mid Journey or with Sora, if I have my literature skill, I can transform that and become probably a content creator in some industry. In terms of scale, I've seen a few reports that have given indexes of different industries. As you're saying, customer service representatives are probably going to be affected to a larger extent than some other industries. Third question: what the government can do? I think there are to that extent. I would think the government regulation. There are some more general government regulation policy, and there are more industry specific policy on regulation. At a very high level, I think industry agnostic we want to focus on. It's probably true for a lot of general purpose technologies, right? we want to upskill our current workforce. We want to retrain some of them so they can do some other job. Right? I mentioned about the content creation as being one, but if you think about 2 years ago, we wouldn't have this position called prompt engineer, but now we do. And there's a huge market because you still need from a regular people and a large language model, you still need someone to translate. The other dimension, of course, is also providing a social safety net, right? This is related to, I think, I do a little bit of research on blockchain as well. So I've been looking at Sam Altman, the founder of OpenAI, actually have another project called the World Coin. The idea is by collecting biological data, you can sort of build a database where eventually when the day comes, you can have a very efficient way to distribute like a uniform basic income. I'm not 100% on board with collecting large scale biological biometric information, but I think more or less we're moving towards that direction, right? Because digital transformation is really about replacing a lot of variable cost by fixed cost, and there will be a large scale redistribution effort, which should be led by the government. So that's more on the generic policy part, right? In terms of specific industry policy, I think that really depends on what kind of specific impact generative AI or AI has on this, right? In a recent paper that we wrote, we basically focus on the creative industry. We're arguing two related regulations, basically the fair use standard and copyrightability, which is whether AI content should be enjoy copyright protection, right? The idea there is basically to make policy recommendations based on how economic agents in the entire value chain will react, right? How would these industry-specific policies or these regulations should help develop both the AI should foster both AI technology as well as to increase the creators' collective income as well as balancing social welfare.
Again, you raised some very interesting points. You said you are obviously, you see some level of reskilling is going to be necessary. One of our guests who came in had suggested a AI transformation fund. You said we are slowly moving towards UBI, universal basic income. Now we've had
Towards that
even
direction. I would
towards
think.
that direct because we've had several venture capitalists like Vinod Khosla and others saying that's where the future is going to be, and government should look at that, even though that's in some places it's controversial. And then you talked about creators safety from a before I get to the creators part, from a fund standpoint for this transformation that people need to do. Do you think having some kind of a fund available for companies or some kind of incentives available for the companies for them to upskill or reskill, like you suggested, is necessary, Professor?
This is a very interesting idea. Just to clarify, so this fund is it to set up by companies like technology giants who made a lot of money in AI, or was it for every company? Like I work in a school, should my school put aside a certain budget? Which one was that?
One of the suggestions was where these AI companies were going to make a lot of money. They would pour some money into this fund. The government would match that fund, and you would have this AI transformation fund that would be available for companies maybe who are laying off people. So they would be able to reskill them so that they are ready for the next job. Because major transformation is, as you said, is coming. So this was just a thought which I've kind of expanded on, that maybe these AI companies who are going to benefit in huge ways should put some kind of an investment into this fund. But it's any thoughts on that, on an AI transformation
Oh,
fund?
I haven't thought about that. It's a very
Okay.
interesting idea. I think as long as I don't necessarily agree that this should be made compulsory.
Of course.
But I think it's probably incentive compatible for some of the technology companies to do that anyway, right?
Exactly.
At least at minimal, they could develop more materials for potential users, and it is because eventually they could be there, whether direct customer or indirect consumer,
Yeah.
doing this type of thing would actually help the technology companies as well. I don't even know if the government need to match the fund, given that the incentive is strong enough for
Right.
technology companies. Yeah, I think it's a great idea.
We'll follow up on that with you, Professor. Professor, you talked about a paper that you did on some of the creative folks. Just when an AI generates some creative output, text, music, images that resembles copyrighted work, who, in your view, holds the copyright? Does it depend on human intervention or the specific training data used?
This is a very good question. I think the status quo is not very clear.
Hmm.
Because different legislations, different jurisdictions now there are already cases coming up, and they've reached a very different conclusion. For example, in the U.S., there have been a few rulings saying AI generated content, even though it has a big human component and it has won prestigious art awards, that could not enjoy copyright, right? In the more recent Chinese case, the judge actually granted this type of copyrights. In our paper, we're actually taking a different perspective from what have been done in the legal community, which they look back into legal tradition, right? Our point here is because the value chain, the content creation value chain is very different when AI is involved. So the policy should be taken into consideration of not only those traditional things, but also how this type of policies will affect content creators' income as well as further AI development, which could have some spillover effect, right? And our point there is basically if you think about whether AI content should be copyrightable,
Hmm.
right? There are different trade-offs. So if I make AI content more copyrightable, that will encourages AI content generation, which
Hmm.
has a positive side or have a negative side, right? The positive side is because AI generation it basically requires a lower entry barrier. It's lower cost, so it would encourage more content generation, right? That will eventually could benefit consumers. But these could also crowd out some content creators or substitute some content creators who are traditionally doing pure human generation, right? So there's a bit of substitution effect. It's not clear whether that's good or bad. Then it also has an impact on the AI company, right? For example, if I pose this question, when I make AI content, when I allow AI content to enjoy copyright, would that encourage the AI company to further develop the AI models, or would they actually disencourage them? Right. This is actually unclear. Our analysis shows that this really depends on the competition landscape. Because when I make the output that you generate more valuable, maybe I'm already happy with this, so I'm not going to generate a lot. So this happens when going back to your earlier point, if there's a lack of competition, the AI copyrightability may actually not help AI company, not help model development. But when we have a healthy level of competition, allowing AI content to be copyrightable is actually beneficial for model development. I think that was also the approach, the sort of argument the Chinese judge who was ruling in favor of this. That's her argument as well. So there are other dimensions as well, but our point was basically when we look at these policies, whether it's fair use standard or AI copyrightability, they should really be sort of, I don't want to say scenario specific, but they should really be conditioned towards different industrial structures, technology development, and another thing we emphasized is data availability.
We've had the CEO of the Copyright Association on our podcast, and their view is that if data is ingested that has copyright in there, then that is copyright and attribution is due, whether it's financial or per se. The question obviously is if you were to take from a creator's perspective, what safeguards would be most helpful for them to protect their work so that uh, to ensure that they get proper attribution if it influences AI generated outputs, Professor? I'm now wearing the creator's hat. These are small
Right.
people, small entrepreneurs, or somebody's written an essay or a song or something like.
So I think it's a very interesting angle that you pointed out, right? When you first talk about creators, so they come to my mind two type of creators. One is the type of creator that they use generative AI tools to create content,
Mm.
right? That's what we were talking about, whether
Right,
these content should be copyrightable so that they
right.
can generate a stream of income. The other is, as you mentioned, if I will call them human creator or original
Mm,
creator, maybe there is a feeling that their sort of welfare has been hurt or they were not properly compensated when their material is used by the AI. So that falls into the sort of category of the fair use standard. There are different. I believe there are different approaches to look at this problem. So if I think about from a social welfare maximization perspective, the argument is really whether in the current environment, you already have sufficient data that has training data that has already been generated, or the AI company are already short of data that they really want to incentivize creators to generate new original data for AI training. Our analysis, our argument are basically these two scenarios are different, right?
okay.
In the first case, if we already have a lot of training data, new training data is not that crucial for AI development. In general, our argument is generous fair use have its benefit. Right? Of course, you can argue there are some fairness concerns, but in the other dimension, in the other regime where we say we have a limited amount of training data, in
Mm,
that case, even from the AI company's perspective, they may not have realized that, but even from the AI company's perspective, more strict fair use standard, which gives more rights to the creators, will be beneficial because they may run into the scenario that they don't have training data to work with, right? That's from a more sort of social welfare maximization perspective. And if we look at exactly how you could actually do this, I really believe in the roller coast type of approach. You basically bargain, you negotiate in the shadow of the law. The idea is, I believe different stakeholders or different players in the value chain, the creator value chain, could play different roles,
mm,
right? A lot of companies these days, when AI companies, when they obtain training data, most of them have passed the state where they just crawl data from the internet,
mm.
right? They normally a lot of them purchase it either from a publisher, from a platform, or from a third party sort of data aggregator. These type of new intermediaries, like data intermediary, right? They could play a role in terms of facilitating collective bargaining, right? Or if let's say some AI companies want to sign some exclusive contracts with certain creators. I think that falls into more of a value chain business model innovation perspective. I think there are a
Mm.
lot of things that certainly can be done.
So that's very interesting. What you're saying is data aggregators will be something that'll come up, and that'll be something that we'll be engaged with. We have entrepreneurs listening. I'm sure that's also a business opportunity. But also, you're saying it'll depend on the quantity of data that is available for ingestion. That's where it will all come down to in terms of fair use, other areas. Professor, we've covered many, many different areas. We've covered existential risk. We've covered employment transformation. We've covered open source. We've covered monopolies. We've covered copyright creators rules. And there's so many more that I could ask you about, but maybe we need to get you on again because this has been a very, very interesting conversation. Professor, finally, for our audience, if you were to leave them with some thoughts, opinions, or input as we build towards sensible regulation, please, if you have a few minutes, to tell them your thoughts.
Sure, I think sensible regulation is is of course very important for the development of AI and for human welfare, right? And what I want to advocate is really a sensible regulatory regime or sensible regulatory decisions needs to be made in a highly interdisciplinary way, right? There is the ethical perspective, there is the legal perspective, and there is the business perspective. My research mainly falls into the business dimension. And even if we look at the entire value chain of AI, right, for each industry that AI could be applied to, we could adopt more sort of methodological approach to look at different links within this value chain. And we could, the regulators or the business leaders, right, look at how would each stakeholder will react to certain regulation. And so basically, to quote some economic term, we want the regulation to be the regulation has to be incentive compatible, and we want to have a more comprehensive understanding of the business value chain, so that we don't run into this type of unintended consequence. To take one step back, even after taking this comprehensive approach, there will be some consequences which we don't foresee, right? That's the nature of fast, rapidly developing technologies. So another important point I want to highlight is the regulation should be really done in an agile, adaptive way, right? I would say I would think more principle-based regulation rather than rule-based regulation. That's going to be more beneficial, not only for business but for our overall community.
Those are some fantastic points, more agile based, not rule based, principle based. Professor Yang, thank you so much for giving our listeners some amazing insights across the board. It's been a great conversation. I'm sure our listeners really appreciate it. And for our listeners, these conversations from a diverse background become really important. So please keep listening and continue this dialogue. Thank you so much, Professor Yang, for being with us.
Thank you, Sanjay. It's been a tremendous pleasure for me.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Regulating AI Innovate Responsibly podcast. You'll find links in the show notes to any resources mentioned on the show. If you're enjoying our podcast, please subscribe so you'll never miss an episode and leave us a 5-star review.